Americans make up 5% of the world's population, but produce 25% of its carbon dioxide emissions. The US is one of only 2 nations to have rejected the Kyoto Protocol, and with it, mandatory cuts in polluting emissions. In these 3 programmes, I'll be looking at the approach to tackling climate change being taken by corporate America and at grassroots activism amongst ordinary people. But we're starting with gasoline. Can America be weaned off its addiction to oil? And there are plenty of enormous gas-guzzling vehicles on show here. But is the tide turning?
Well, here it is, the Chevrolet Volt, an electrically driven car from General Motors. I am shocked. A GM electric vehicle is an inconvenient truth.
General Motors boss Richard Wagner admits that, like it or not, the era of gasoline is ending.
For us, I think it's really a business necessity that we find alternative sources of propulsion for our vehicles, because if we continue to rely almost exclusively on petroleum, greater and greater demand for that petroleum, and at some point we either run out or it gets priced very high, and obviously some anxiety on where it's located.
There's been a profound change in the thinking about oil here in America. Worry about the price and security of oil supplies from the Middle East has coincided with grave concern about global warming to unite people of different political persuasions. Even religious groups have entered the debate. The Evangelical Environmental Network runs a website called What Would Jesus Drive? Terry Tamminen is former secretary of the California Environment Protection Agency and now special advisor to the state's governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger.
When you look at what it's truly costing us, it's probably about $6 or $7 a gallon more than whatever we're paying at the pump. And that's because of the cost of tax subsidies and healthcare costs and defense costs around the globe for defending our supply of oil, just to name a few.
And here we have a serious problem. America is addicted to oil.
We are about to enter into a world that's truly renewable and completely clean if we just had the willpower to implement it.
I believe the problems of global warming will be far greater than the problems of Social Security or even the problems of war on terrorism.
In his hugely influential film, An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore has spoken more powerfully and freely to Americans about the urgent need to curb oil dependency and carbon dioxide emissions than he was able to as Bill Clinton's deputy and as George Bush's opponent in the 2000 presidential election.
If you look at the 10 hottest years ever measured, they've all occurred in the last 14 years. I am Al Gore. I used to be the next president of the United States of America. This is Patagonia, 75 years ago, and the same glacier today. This is Mount Kilimanjaro, 30 years ago, and last year. Within the decade, there will be no more snows of Kilimanjaro. This is really not a political issue so much as a moral issue.
Early this morning, Hurricane Katrina slammed into New Orleans.
We've had 8 years of more warnings. We've had 8 years of more odd weather events, marginal sea level rise. We've had 8 years of unexplained hurricanes. We've had 8 years of this and 8 years of that. And we sure as heck have had 8 years of increasing oil dependency.
As chief editorial writer and assistant editor of the New York Times, Bob Semple has kept a watching brief on the issue of global warming for a decade. He thinks the current collision of climate change and oil dependency in the public mind will have political consequences.
Each one by itself may not be enough to move the needle politically, but if you can point out to people that some of the things that will help us with oil dependency will also help us with global warming and vice versa, then you get people to look at this thing as a win-win proposition instead of something that's likely to hurt their lifestyle in some way.
There's something in these pictures you can't see.
Still, scepticism, some of it funded and fueled by the huge vested interests of big oil, is not to be underestimated.
It's called carbon dioxide, CO2. The fuels that produce CO2 have freed us from a world of back-breaking labor.
This short film in praise of carbon emissions, which cast doubt on the scientific evidence for climate change, was commissioned by the Competitive Enterprise Institute.
Global warming alarmists claim the glaciers are melting because of carbon dioxide from the fuels we use. Let's force people to cut back, they say. But we depend on those fuels to grow our food, move our children, light up our lives. Carbon dioxide, they call it pollution. We call it life.
Is Al Gore surprised that this kind of material is still in circulation, even now?
I'm not totally surprised, no. There's money in pollution, and some of the carbon polluters that are not among the responsible companies, the ones that don't want any change to threaten their profits, have actually been spending a good bit of money to sow this confusion, and they have found a fertile ground simply because none of us like to think about something that involves painful contemplations like the climate crisis and sacrifices. Although the word sacrifice is one that should be used carefully, simply because most of the changes needed to solve the climate crisis are ones that will save us money and make our lives better.
Sadly, this process is still going on. As the former head of California's Environmental Protection Agency, I can tell you that there's still a lot of secondhand smoke being blown in our faces by oil companies and auto companies trying to tell us that their products are less harmful than they really are, and to use their amazing lobbying power and the money that they have with political candidates and other things to try to get out from under regulations and get exemptions from our Clean Water Act, from our Clean Air Act, and from a whole host of other environmental laws that apply to all the rest of us and all the other businesses in this country.
The Congress is now controlled by Democrats, who are traditionally more green-leaning, and though Barbara Boxer, an ardent advocate of action on climate change, has taken over the chairmanship of the Senate Environment Committee from James Inhofe, who consistently described global warming as the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people, federal inertia remains a major obstacle to change. Just weeks ago, automakers' supporters again fought off efforts to raise what's called the CAFE standard. That's the average fuel consumption of car makers' fleets of vehicles. The average fuel economy of new cars here has actually gone down since 1988. The frustration with government was given voice at the Live Earth concert in the summer by the environment lawyer and campaigner, Robert Kennedy Jr.
But I will tell you this, the most important thing you can do is to get involved in the political process and get rid of all these rotten politicians that we have in Washington, D.C., who are nothing more than corporate toadies for companies like Exxon and Southern Company, and they have their slick public relations firms and their phony think tanks in Washington, D.C. that consistently put their private financial interests ahead of American interests and ahead of the interest of all of humanity.
They also, in more recent years, have used their muscle in court and in lying to the regulators to kill the zero-emission vehicle mandate here in California, which was a mandate that tried to get more truly clean cars on the road. We weren't prescribing any technology, although most people saw that as a mandate for battery electric cars.
No story better illustrates the auto industry's resistance to change than what happened when California issued a mandate that obliged car firms to ensure that 2 to 5% of their fleet sold in the state would be zero-emission vehicles by the year 2000. General Motors had developed the EV1, a battery-operated car. The film director Chris Payne had one of these cars. Little did he know that he would end up not by continuing to drive it, but by making a documentary about its death. His film, Who Killed the Electric Car, opens with a funeral.
We are here today to say goodbye to a special friend, to say goodbye to an idea. Some might say that to be here gathered today to mourn the loss of a car would be going too far.
The first thing I liked about it was how fast they were. I know that's sort of a pathetic guy thing to say, but you charged them at night, and it was like about 75 cents a gallon in equivalent electricity cost. And you never went to the gas station. You felt like the 21st century had arrived.
The electric car is here.
The EV1 from General Motors.
Plug it in at night, and when I need to drive it, I unplug, drive it away.
They're for people who love the environment. I said they're just for people who love cars. They're for people who have to go somewhere.
By driving an electric car, what are you sparing us from?
I'm saving America, Dave. That's what I'm doing. I am saving America.
Tom Hanks and other celebrities leased EV1s, and interest in them was growing. But having seemingly embraced the idea, General Motors and the other car companies retreated and began to fight the zero emissions mandate, as Terry Tamminen told the BBC World Service.
There was one infamous case it was about the year 2000, as I recall, when there was actually a breakthrough in battery technology in terms of how durable they would be so that you would get as much as 200 miles on a single charge for a typical family sedan. And as they were about to announce that from one division of General Motors, the other division of General Motors was in front of California's Air Resources Board testifying that it wasn't possible to get more than 100 miles on a single charge from any battery technology known to them at that time. And there were actually advertisements that were going to be placed in the Wall Street Journal touting the success of this new 200-mile battery. Those ads had to be quickly withdrawn because their executives were in California lying to us regulators about the state of the technology. So that and many, many other shenanigans were embarked upon to try to undermine this mandate. And finally, as the deadline grew closer and closer and it was clear they weren't going to comply, they took us to court, took the state of California to court.
General Motors argued there was no demand for the electric cars, and customers expected them to be very cheap. Dave Bartness of GM.
We spent in excess of $1 billion to drive this market, to build the market. That means award-winning advertising, developing the vehicle, developing the recharging infrastructure. And in a 4-year time frame, from roughly 1996 to 2000, we were able to lease 800 EV1s. We have heard about these long waiting lists. And frankly, we did have a list of roughly 4,000 people that raised their hands and said, I would be interested in getting into an EV1 and being an EV1 leasee. We contacted each of those folks, and we whittled that list down. And when we actually got down to a point where we were able to have somebody sign on the dotted line, that list from 4,000 people shrunk to about 50.
This is just General Motors speak. General Motors and Ford are the ones who are struggling to keep their doors open and to remain viable businesses because they produce these SUVs and these fuel hog cars when it's Toyota that makes the Prius, the hybrid, Honda makes a hybrid, and the Korean manufacturers and now even Chinese manufacturers are the ones who are making fuel-efficient cars, which Americans are buying in greater numbers. The car companies told us, well, if we have to put in airbags, nobody wants them. We only sell what people want. And of course, when more and more people found out about them and how they save lives, more and more people wanted them. And now car companies fall all over themselves to advertise how many airbags they have.
In fact, there's relatively little profit for car makers in small green cars, certainly in comparison with the massive $30,000 sports utility vehicles, or SUVs, which government tax breaks made more attractive for consumers.
The electric car would begin to compete with their not-so-green cars, specifically in the fact that there's almost no service or maintenance with an electric car. And it turns out that's a big profit center for car companies. And to their credit, the consumers were not rushing out to get them in great numbers in the mid-90s. Oil prices were cheap, and the car companies said nobody wants them, let's get rid of them while nobody's paying attention.
But a lot of the vehicles, the Honda vehicles, the General Motors vehicles, were all leased, and nobody had the option to buy. So the automakers took advantage of that and pulled all the cars off the road. They weren't willing to let people take the cars and actually drive them and keep driving them like normal cars.
Chris Payne and his camera team hired a helicopter and went in search of the recalled EV1s across the Arizona desert.
There they are. We flew over General Motors, and looking down, we could see right next to the racetrack where the EV1 was first tested, we saw, maybe 50 EV1s crushed and put on top of semi-flatbeds right next to the yellow crusher.
And it wasn't only General Motors doing this. No one had seen Honda's electric cars, since they too were recalled from customers, until an episode of California's Green aired on TVS.
So we're going to be able to see cars shredded today.
Absolutely.
Which is not something most of us get to see. You're going to be shredding some new cars here, too. These look like perfectly good cars. Why are you shredding them up?
A little bit of a mystery, really. Since I've been here the last 8 years, they bring us these cars from the dealerships, and they say that they're test cars, and they've been brought over to to test various emissions, and the insurance companies won't reinsure them, so they have to watch them destroyed here.
Boy, that seems like a shame.
It's a terrible
I'd like to drive off in one of these things. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the sound of a crushed automobile being shredded into a million pieces.
I think it's unprecedented for this to happen to a new technology. It wasn't just General Motors, as Toyota was involved, Honda was involved. I mean, they shredded every car. That was maybe my biggest surprise, that they would go to that length.
But now in California, green cars have come full circle.
I'm going to encourage the building of a hydrogen highway to take us to the environmental future.
Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger has done a lot more than just convert one of his own Hummers to run on hydrogen fuel.
We are committed to rolling back our greenhouse gas emissions another 80% by the year 2050. We are passing legislation right now. You know, the White House is not for it, but we are for it. The people of California are for it, and we want to be the leaders in that. And I think the important thing also is to always make sure that people understand that we can do both, which is protect the environment and at the same time have economic growth.
As part of its Global Warming Solutions Act, passed last year, California's pledged to cut emissions back to 1990 levels by 2020, an ambitious target for a state that's grown rapidly in population for the last 15 years. California, in common with several other states and cities across America, has decided not to wait for leadership from federal government. It signed up to Kyoto and introduced measures such as the hydrogen highway. Terry Tamminen.
The hydrogen highway was designed to try to break this chicken or the egg problem, which car companies and oil companies and the public all talk about. It's not that we don't know how to make hydrogen-powered cars. It's that no one wants to mass produce them, which would bring down the cost, make them affordable to either of us, if there's not a refueling network. And of course, energy companies don't want to put in refueling networks if there are no vehicles. So we came up on the idea that you could probably serve a pretty large fleet of hydrogen vehicles if you used our interstate highway system, which is our big freeway system here in California. And if you placed a station about every 20 miles, that means everyone would have pretty good access to the stations. You'd only need about 200 and you could cover the entire state. And so people could drive anywhere in the state with a hydrogen-powered car, and yet you wouldn't need that many stations to at least get this off the ground. We now have about 30, actually we have closer to 40 stations, but 30 that we call hydrogen highway stations because they're actually open to the public. The others are private demonstration projects. But a good 30 or so at this point that are proving the technology. We have hundreds of hydrogen-powered cars and trucks and buses in operation here in California today.
It's in our vital interest to diversify America's energy supply. We need to press on with battery research for plug-in and hybrid vehicles and expand the use of clean diesel vehicles and biodiesel fuel. We must continue investing in new methods of producing ethanol, and now even more dramatic advances are within reach. Tonight I ask Congress to join me in pursuing a great goal. Let us build on the work we've done and reduce gasoline usage in the United States by 20% in the next 10 years.
What if we could turn the whole world yellow? We'd have cleaner air and an energy source that grows back every year. Yellow is the color of corn, refined into E85 ethanol, a fuel that lowers greenhouse gas emissions and can reduce our dependence on oil.
Meeting tough targets will require the US to invest in several competing technologies to replace oil. There is, to use the phrase of the moment here, no single magic bullet. Sir Chris Bintical, leading environmentalist and former British ambassador to the United Nations, sees design faults in many of the options, including the current craze for maize. Producing ethanol this way is a bad idea for one simple reason.
You thereby take away land that would have been used for growing food, and instead you grow fuel. And in addition to growing the fuel, you need carbon dioxide in order to refine it and turn it into fuel. You're not actually helping anyone, because at the moment there have been what have been called tortilla riots in Mexico, due to the fact that the price of grain has gone up so much that it is having bad effects elsewhere. So there's a whole mix of things which suggest that any emphasis on ethanol is not in fact going to be the right solution. And then you've got another device which is trying to produce hydrogen-driven cars. That also causes a lot of problems because in the process of making hydrogen, on most methods, you generate an awful lot of carbon dioxide. And nobody has yet discovered exactly how to store hydrogen. And so that's another technical device that may be useful in some respects, but is certainly not going to solve the problem and will need a lot more research before it's any good.
So, back at the motor show, the newly unveiled Chevrolet Volt is received by independent observers, such as popular science writer Eric Adams, with cautious optimism.
Now, the problem is that it's going to take a big advance in the battery technology to make the Volt work. It's going to need very lightweight, high power, and low-heat lithium-ion batteries, and they're at least 3, 4, or 5 years away from that. So there's still a bunch of hurdles for this car to happen. But when it does, the result is a car that could get up to, I think it's 150 miles per gallon, and they're also exploring the fact that it doesn't necessarily have to be an internal combustion engine, a gasoline engine that charges the batteries. It could be hydrogen fuel cell on board. It could be ethanol. It could be diesel. It could be natural gas. It could be any number of technologies that drives that thing. GM is saying optimistically 2010, but my guess is more like 2012.
In the meantime, everyone's agreed that the answer to the question, can America go green, will come into sharper focus as the 2008 presidential election draws nearer. And candidates, including Hillary Clinton, are sounding brave on standing up to big oil interests.
I'm proposing new legislation that would create a strategic energy fund. We can create this fund from the windfall profits of the oil companies that just announced the largest earnings of any companies in the history of the planet. We'll tell them to play or pay, to invest in alternative energy themselves, or to pay a portion of their excess profits from the spike in oil prices into the Strategic Energy Fund. We'll also repeal oil company subsidies that they just don't need anymore,